Well, the issue of gun violence, gun rights, and gun restrictions took center stage today when President Obama and Vice President Biden announced in a news conference that this issue will not only be a priority, but that action will be taken immediately. The president says he'll advocate to strengthen and reinstate the assault weapons ban, a 10-round limit for ammunition magazines, and that he hopes to increase access to mental health and require a criminal background check on every gun sale. Now, he signed 23 executive actions, including improving the federal background check system, beefing up efforts to prevent gun violence and prosecute gun crimes, nominate a director on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and to focus more on the mental health aspect, including a reminder to healthcare providers that no federal law prohibits them from reporting threats of violence.
The only way we will be able to change is if their audience, their constituents, their membership says this time must be different. That this time we must do something to protect our communities and our kids. I will put everything I've got into this, and so will Joe. But I tell you, the only way we can change is if the American people demand it.
Well, those in favor of stricter gun laws applauded the president's actions. However, those who think the government has no place making any laws about guns are going on the defensive immediately. So we want to explore the ins and outs of this issue, and joining me now to do just that, Roger Pilon, Vice President of Legal Affairs at Cato Institute, and George Zornick, Washington reporter for The Nation magazine. Gentlemen, I want to welcome you to the program today. Let me just start by asking you, Roger, in your opinion, what will today's announcements accomplish?
Not a lot. The 23 measures that he himself is going to take, if you look at them, they're relatively trivial. For example...
And pretty vague as well.
Oh, pretty vague as well. Calling for the Centers for Disease Control to do a study of the causes of gun violence, as if we don't have a pretty good handle of that already. Other measures deal with data sharing, and those are important, better data sharing, because right now that is a problem. But most of the measures that are the ones that we hear about, the restriction on assault weapons and so forth, is going to take legislation. That can be done by executive order.
Right, and George, I mean, talk to me about this, because a lot of what the president did today is sort of call Congress to action to keep this topic, keep a bright light, shining on this topic. How realistic is it really that some of the more important issues will be dealt with by Congress?
Well, I think some of them have a pretty good chance of passage. I don't think we'll see an assault weapons ban, unfortunately, but I do think there's pretty broad bipartisan support for closing the gun show loophole, for expanded background checks, for limiting high-capacity magazines, if not the weapons. I've heard Republicans come out in favor of that. So I think it's possible some of that stuff gets through, and if it doesn't, it at least sets the table for future action, so that the people who vote against it, perhaps that becomes an issue in the next midterms. Maybe the terrain gets more fertile next time around, and it can be the start of something that, if it doesn't happen now, maybe it happens in 4 years, 6 years, 8 years from now. I
think it's a good point that the ball is rolling, because after all, this is an issue that for so long no lawmaker on either side of the aisle really wanted to touch. And yet it's interesting, because 30,000 Americans die every year from gun violence. And, we talk about the war in Iraq, for example, about 4,300 Americans died. So what do you think? I mean, is the NRA a little bit out of touch with Americans when it wants zero laws at all?
Well, the Americans are deeply divided on this issue, as all the polls show. When you talk about gun violence, of course, included in that is everything from suicide to police using guns to apprehend criminals, to the war on drugs, which is a big source of the gun violence in the country today, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to something like increased background checks for gun shows, that 85% of the American people support, and I think that probably will be passed. But then when you get to some of these other issues, for example, the restrictions on large volume magazines. He wants to reduce or stop the sale of 30-round magazines and allow only 10-round magazines. Well, that is just simply putting your head in the sand, because it takes about 2 seconds to switch magazines. So if my arithmetic is correct, 3 10-round magazines equals 1 30-round magazine, and so you're not going to accomplish anything by that. It's sort of a feel-good measure.
And yet, quite a few people are citing this as perhaps something that could have stopped other events. And I've never shot, you know, with this kind of magazines. But they say,
how could it do it
if
it takes 2 seconds to switch magazines? You've accomplished nothing.
Let me ask you, George. I mean, people are saying that fewer deaths would have happened at the Gabby Gifford shooting, at the movie theater shooting.
Yeah, I think it's a useful public policy measure. Look, it's not just 30-round magazines. There are 60-round magazines out there. There are 100-round. The shooter in Aurora used a 100-round magazine. And what's interesting, if you look at that shooting, is that there was at most 90 seconds between the first 911 call, presumably when he came into the theater, and when the police responded. And in that 90 seconds, he shot 71 people. So I think and I agree that reducing the magazine size isn't going to solve the whole problem, but every second, I think, in tragic situations like this counts. And I think I have yet to hear from most gun rights advocates a compelling personal liberty case for owning, you know, a 60-round or 30-round magazine over, say, a 10-round one.
Of course, nothing will be done to call back the millions of large round magazines that are out there, the millions of assault weapons that are out there. And so I think when you look at this from the guns perspective, this is really kind of feel-good legislation. The one measure that would immediately be able to be implemented and would serve to reduce, not eliminate, but you can't eliminate all of this, but reduce substantially this, is if we did have armed guards at places that are now gun-free zones. And that, of course, is something that the American people do support.
Except for the fact that we're at a time when Congress is debating the money that this country spends, the debt that this country has. Adding armed guards to every school would be an extraordinary additional cost to the budget.
No, this is not something that belongs to the federal government to do. This is a local issue. Education is primarily a state and local issue. Therefore, communities can go in this direction if they want to. They don't have to.
I mean, but look at Sandy Hook Elementary. This wasn't in an area that ever saw any kind of violence. This wasn't at a school where there were metal detectors.
To be sure, but these are, in fact, that's just the point. These are very isolated incidents. And so the question becomes, how much measures do you want to take? What kinds of measures do you want to take if it is so rare? And that's up to a community to decide. We're seeing communities today, for example, there's been stories about in Pennsylvania, where communities are moving in this direction because they have decided for themselves, we want to spend the money for this. And this is the way it should be in this country. That's why we have federalism in this country, is because each state can approach this as it wants to approach it.
George, I want you to get in here and respond to that.
I don't think more security at schools is per se a bad idea, but I'm not sure that it does much to address the problem. You saw in Virginia Tech, which is the worst school shooting in American history, there was not only one armed guard, but an entire armed police force that wasn't able to stop the slaughter. On top of that, this year you've seen, you know, while Newtown is spurring people to action, it's not the only place, unfortunately, where mass gun violence is happening. You're seeing just this year mass shootings at movie theaters, spas, churches, shopping malls, and so militarizing the society.
And lots of those places do have guards, and others do not. For example, there was a shooting about a month ago out in Oregon, in a mall in Oregon, and someone was there with a gun to stop the shooter. Yeah, it's a good thing that you mentioned, George, the Virginia Tech case, because there is a case where, as you know, we have 41 states in the country that allow concealed carry. If one of the students in that class had a weapon, we might have had 1 or 2 deaths, not 32. That's a big difference.
I want to, you had mentioned earlier in the discussion the American people and sort of where their public opinion is. There's a new Washington Post ABC poll. I just want to put the results up of that. And it shows that 59% of people surveyed said that Obama and Congress should make enacting stricter gun control laws a priority. So I guess I just want to get your take. I mean, the NRA is one thing. Gun rights advocates, you know, certainly are not all in one category. But George, talk about this. I mean, why can't, if 59% of Americans feel this way, that this should be a top priority, why is it so difficult to get any changes passed?
I think for one reason, you know, while that may be broadly shared, it's much less popular among the Republican base, and what a lot of the Republican members of Congress are worried about are not how they do in the general election, but how they do in the primaries. So even if they may personally support, more background checks, smaller magazines, what have you, what they're worried about is that in the primary, they get an NRA-funded, more right-wing opponent who comes in and calls them a gun grabber, and then all of a sudden they're out of a job. So that's going to be a big obstacle.
Well, that's one aspect, to be sure. Another aspect is that the country has various parts that are very strong gun supporters, as opposed to, say, the Northeast. But when you go to speak about gun control and you speak about, for example, assault weapons, the immediate problem that arises is, well, what do you mean by an assault weapon? And this comes up in, for example, the legislation that came out of New York State just the day before yesterday, because they define it as a rifle or a pistol that has a magazine and one military-style feature. Well, what's a military-style feature? I mean, this was the way the original legislation back in '94 was styled. And, of course, it was very easy to get around that. You just manufacture your weapon differently, and it no longer has a, quote, military-style feature. So the definition is very, very difficult.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. The whole issue, of course, very complex. And I want to talk about another aspect of it here. Shortly after both President Obama's reelection and, of course, the shootings in Newtown, Connecticut, ammunition in this country started flying off the shelves. This is according to police departments around the country. Police departments actually having a very tough time being able to get their hands on ammunition. There are shortages. People are worried that their guns will be, that they will no longer be allowed to have their guns, that they will no longer be allowed to have ammo. George, talk about this. I mean, is there a gray area between, no guns and just a couple stricter laws? Because a lot of people say that once you tighten the belt strap a little bit on these laws, that it's just going to keep getting worse.
Oh, I'm not aware of any major politician who's in favor of confiscating all guns in America, whether they...
But that's a very popular argument for people.
It is. It's an argument made by gun manufacturers and their allies in the media and the nonprofit sector who want people to believe that so that people go buy more guns. But in fact, I don't see that as anything politically viable as long as any of us are alive. I think a lot of the restrictions are just common sense ones. The president pointed out today that he wanted to ban armor-piercing bullets, which police departments don't want to see. They don't want people shooting bullets to their vests, and I think that's something where you might find a lot of common ground on. But I've yet to see anyone actually seriously propose confiscating all bullets.
What do you think about this argument, Roger?
Well, George and I are in agreement on that. I mean, I think it's an overreaction, although it is in the background. I mean, we have seen in other countries where confiscation of guns did follow registration. I mean, it's one of the first things Hitler did, for example. So it is not a completely lunacy to believe that. But in this country, I don't think it's in the offing anywhere in the near future, because we are a culture that is very deeply in love with our guns. At least lots of people, for hunting, for sport, for collection, and so on and so forth.
But how do we change the discussion or the debate to say, these sort of more extreme laws don't have to equal, so Obama's going to take my gun?
We haven't yet said anything about what is the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and that's the mental health issue.
I think it's a really good point.
That's right, and that is the issue that is the most difficult. We saw in the New York State legislation that came out yesterday or the day before, a requirement for mental health professionals to report to mental health officials people that they suspect may be dangerous to themselves or others. Well, that raises very serious questions. If they fail to report, they could be prosecuted, but there is a good faith exception. Well, there's all kinds of room for difficulties there. But the biggest problem, and there are two major problems. First of all, it runs right up against the doctor-patient relationship,
right.
The privacy elements of that. And even more important, it would discourage people
from
that we
help.
Want to seek help from getting it if they know that they are going to be reported to law enforcement officials. And so, I mean, the thing we want to do is to encourage these people to get help.
George, we have about 30 seconds left. Your take on sort of the mental health aspect of this?
That's actually somewhere where we absolutely agree. I would hate to see people discouraged. There already is a requirement in the law that if a psychiatrist or doctor thinks their patient is in imminent danger, that they are required to call the police. I think going beyond that would be bad policy.
Yeah, certainly an interesting discussion, and I think an intelligent one. And it shows right here that there is agreement, even for two people who sort of disagree on this issue, that there is gray matter, that there are areas where some progress can be made. Roger Pilon, Vice President of Legal Affairs at Cato Institute, and George Zornick, Washington reporter for The Nation magazine. Thank you both for being on the show.
You're welcome.